my paper today is going to be sort of based on some archives that are held by the Clayton Collection, that's linked to Chester's Museum, that are housed at Corbridge. And it's two separate archives. One that Grace deposited, mostly linked to her time with the Clayton Collection, and then one that Captain Keith, who owned all the land and owned the house and that the fort's on, deposited for his time when he was with the trustees. And the title came up mainly because when someone asks you for a title, you have grand expectations and write yourself a fancy title because you don't want to be boring. But it's because, as Tatiana mentioned, and as quite a lot of the women that we've talked about today, Grace was the daughter of an archaeologist and the daughter of an archaeologist on the wall, F G Simpson, Frank Gerald. He was acclaimed Emperor of the Wall because at the height of his career, he was regarded really as a major authority on Hadrian's Wall, on its origin and construction, and he was given a CBE in 1949 for 46 years of work on the excavation and preservation of the wall. And, you know, that's big footsteps to follow if you're going to be an archaeologist. So this is not an exhaustive run through Grace's achievements or her archaeological career. It's very much kind of looking at elements for the wall and, you know, did she leave the shadow, and if she didn't, why? So the background to Grace, born in 1920 in Boston, Lincolnshire, and died in 2007. As I said, she was brought up in an archaeological world. Her father, F G Simpson, took her to lectures. She remembers when she was 8 meeting Flinders Petrie and shaking his hand. She met Kate Hodgson, who we've talked about earlier, and also when she was at university, she was taught by Kathleen Kenyon. And I think both the fact that she was meeting all these archaeologists, obviously she's like me, she wanted to be archaeologist from a very young age, but it's quite important to think that she was meeting female archaeologists in positions working in or working on archaeology. Maybe they weren't working in if they're not paid, you know. So she enrolled in the Institute of Archaeology in London, and this is a quote from her that is basically as soon as she heard that courses were reopening in September 1945, she hurried to London, was interviewed, paid a fee of 2 guineas, and I was in. And I think, you know, that was her hooked then. She moved up to Durham to be a research assistant for 4 years, and it was there that she really moved into pottery studies. So that's often where she's most known, really, is in pottery studies. She was a founding member of the Re Quatare Romane Flores in 1957, and then in 1960 she received her doctorate at Oxford, and there's a copy on the table back there. Interestingly, her older sister didn't go into archaeology, so I don't know whether she'd, you know, not enjoyed going to lectures. And I really tried to write this talk without putting a slide for FG. I don't know why I always call him FG in my head rather than but it needed to be there just to give a bit more background. He, as I said, took Grace to lectures from a young age. He trained as a draftsman, as a naval engineer, but decided that was not his career, and he was going into archaeology. And a point that kind of came to me whilst I was listening to a couple of the talks, and which I've thought about previously, is that he was able to do that, so to turn down what was probably a very steady, fairly well-paid job because of family money. That family money didn't last, and if we had another talk, we would talk about some of the issues that plagued Gerald. But I think all of the women we've talked about mostly are in a position where they can go and do archaeology, either because the parents are letting them, but then they also have to have the money to do that because most of them are not going to be paid. And Grace was able to do that, but never quite to the same extent that some of the others. So she, there were issues, and that's part of, I think, what happens with the Clayton trustees, because F G Simpson was almost bankrupt, really, when he died, and that plagued Grace afterwards. But I also wanted to mention a father because he had quite a lot of mental health issues, which came and went throughout his career, but really did affect his career and affected a lot of his relationships with people. He also had a very strong personality, which lots of men working on archaeology and on the wall, that was quite standard. when a woman has it, it is different. But it did mean that he didn't always make friends because he never let the point go. And I think both her father's illness and his relationships, good and bad, with other people, did have a big effect on sort of her tenacity and not letting things go. She was very, very protective of her father's reputation, and it's quite key. And also that when her father was working and when she was working, I think a lot more than there are today, and I count myself very lucky that I've only been working and studying the wall for the last 20 years, that there was a lot more factions, I'd say. David would probably, you know, this group of people believe this following so-and-so, and the same. And if you're, you know, on the wrong side of it, you can't talk to those people there, and vice versa. I think talking to colleagues across Europe, it's still like that in some places. But again, I think Grace falls foul of that because she doesn't sit in her box. She says what she thinks, whether or not she's supposed to. So just a couple of slides about some of the things that she's done. Oh, yeah, there we go. So her first job, I suppose, post university was as a research assistant at Durham University with Eric Burley, who we saw on Tatiana's slide. And she completed the work left by Stanfield when he died, before completing the work that we've mentioned, Central Gaulish Potters, which is still the standard work. I am not a pottery person, so don't ask me anything about it. But I think the key thing is this was solid, uncontroversial archaeological work. Her name was on it. She was finishing Stanfield's work, but she got her name attributed to it, and she moved on. She didn't just collect his papers together and publish them. She went and did further work. So she went around Europe, went into museums, met lots of people who she stayed in touch with for her whole life, added, you know, lots of rubbings. Her collection of Samian rubbings and other papers were deposited in an archive, and they're still used today. And I think this also is at a time when she's in favour with the people who are working on the wall. So at that point, Eric Burley, you know, she's in his, you know, sunny side, and he's given her this job. She becomes, in 1950, the honorary curator of the Clayton collection. All the curators have been honorary, so it's not just that she's a woman, it's a trust thing. But at some point that goes wrong, and Martha and I have been umming and ahhing, we're not quite sure when, but she falls out with Eric over something, we don't know what. And that makes a big difference. If Eric Burley is not in your favour, you are not in favour on the wall. And I think she wouldn't take that lying down and would, you know, sort of, you don't like me, fair enough, I'm going to carry on my way. It's probably to her detriment a little bit. But just to explain her link, so this is Chester's Museum. So the Clayton collection, group of material from Hadrian's Wall, excavated between 1840 and 1890 under the auspices of John Clayton. He never picked up a spade. It's William Telford, who you can just see here, who was his foreman and then caretaker of the museum. The museum itself opened in 1896. This is a late 1890s photograph. And then in 1930, the collection was at risk of sale, and so the trustees of the Clayton collection were formed to save the collection. They were all local landowners, dignitaries, archaeologists of the time. And in 1950, Grace is invited to become the honorary curator. Eric Burley is possibly the chairman then, I'm not quite sure. And it's obviously through her relationship with Eric. Her father also had a link. So in the early 1900s, F G Simpson was the estate archaeologist for the Claytons, going around and repairing the ruins that had been exposed, some of them for 50, 60 years by that point, and doing more excavations. And in 1950, when she was appointed, it makes sense because she's living in Durham. It's not that far away. But she moves down to Oxford, and that makes the job very tricky. And there is very little money in the Clayton collection. And that's a lot of the sort of tension rises from that. And the trustees questioning, why is she spending this money to come up from Oxford? And she says, I'm a curator. I need to see the things. I need to go and, you know, facilitate research visits or do work. And you can see in the minutes where relationships start to degrade, because I think if you're happy with someone's work, often you will let things go, you know, and certain things can slide. But as soon as you are looking for problems, you start to nitpick. And she wasn't the best at account keeping, which I think is quite, it annoyed the treasurer quite a lot. But also, it goes back to the fact that she wasn't independently hugely wealthy. So if she's getting a train from Oxford up to Newcastle and then the train or a taxi to get to the museum, she needs to claim that back. But many of the other trustees were not in a position that they required travel expenses, A, because they lived closer, or B, because they were independently wealthy. And it starts to bring up tensions. This photograph on the right is the museum in the early 2000s, just to give you an idea. It's still very much kept as a Victorian museum. And this photograph here of Grace is, again, in the early 2000s, taken by Georgina Plowright, who's my predecessor as the curator, with the picture of her father. And we have in the archive, as well as the papers that Grace left, some of her notebooks from her time as curator. And they show really that she was very hardworking. She was really ambitious about what the collection could be and what should be done with it. And can I go back? Yeah. So you'll see the museum still looks quite Victorian, and that's purposeful. But Grace didn't think that just because it looked Victorian, that you should let things deteriorate and she should be keeping up with modern standards of things. And she got frustrated by what she saw as lack of progress. And she was very firm on what should be done. She was trying to enact best practice. And this was a copy from a notebook when Ministry of Works were doing some consolidation of the fort. She's noting down where all the objects have come from and the date. She's also dealing with quite a lot of issues with conservation because these cases, I'm going to be annoying and keep going back, these are the original cases that were purchased in 1896. They are not good for objects. We still have some of those old cases now, but they've been retrofitted with quite a lot of other things so we can maintain the humidity and look after the objects. That wasn't the case when Grace was in charge. And so she's having to find grants for the conservation. There were 2 thefts, one in 63 and one in 69, both of which occurred during the daytime. So that's conversations with the Ministry of Works and the custodians that are on site, that sort of thing. There was also a pheasant was shot and came through the skylight in the 50s. There's a lot sort of going on, and she's trying to do a lot of this practical day-to-day stuff. And anyone who's worked either doing post-excavation with finds or in a museum, it is day-to-day stuff. You need to be there. And she was in Oxford, which made it very difficult. And eventually, it completely blows up. She gets so frustrated by what she sees as a lack of, cooperation by the trustees. Relationships have completely disintegrated. And what I can't work out is there must be some other trigger, because in 1971, she managed to get 2 grants and got some conservation done. Some of the objects went up to Edinburgh. But she continues to berate the trustees in the minutes to other people. And so in early 1972, they force her to leave, and she is not happy. So she publishes a booklet called A History of Non-Conservation, The Rotting Roman Bronzes at Chester's Museum. Annoyingly, I haven't been at the museum recently to get a photograph of the book, but it's a self-published booklet, and she sends it out to all and sundry in the archaeological world. And it is... it is... Yes. It's vitriolic, I think we would say. And she then follows up letters with 61 archaeologists and museum specialists and say, what are you going to do? Support me? And everyone says, the letters or the responses we've got, people say, yes, the objects aren't in great condition, we're not going to do anything, because nobody's going to really go up against the various people who are on the Clayton trustees, but also what could they do? It gets so heated, this whole, can you be sacked for an honorary position? She holds on to paperwork because she's saying, and she gets involved, her solicitor gets involved as the Clayton trustee solicitor. She says, you're not a fit body to look after these collections. I'm maintaining this paperwork as my sort of surety that this collection will be cared for. It gets so personal. And there's a lot of work to be done on why that is. But she was just... It's very tricky because there's a lot of strong personalities on Hadrian's Wall. I'm sure there is wherever you look in sort of periods of archaeology, but mostly it's the men who are strong personalities, and they're, their sort of rule is law, Grace doesn't take that line down, but then also has very little diplomacy, and it's quite. That's almost it's a step too far, particularly because she'd already got some conservation done, and it's really hard to sympathise with her. Much as I try as a curator, these pictures here are some of the old boards. That's outlines of where objects were, and she was trying to sort of get them. It shows you how much light damage has been done. Once she's, managed to return, she's returned all the papers, all the objects to the Clayton trustees, and she moves on to almost the next bee in her bonnet, which was her father and his legacy. So when her father, during his last illness, in periods of remission, he dictated a lot of his findings to Grace, and then, but then he actually died of a heart attack. It was unrelated to the other illnesses, but she takes upon herself to publish these unpublished works because she feels very deeply that this material should be published, and F G Simpson had been previously very good at publishing as he went along. So there's his work, but she also has a large section at the front, sort of an homage to her father. She does the finds reports for the pottery, she gets other people in. It's all sort of good archaeological work, but there's also a lot of digs in it at people who either she saw not supporting her father, not doing anything, and I'm just leaving there that there's a very memorable published dispute between her and Charles Daniels about this, because, sorry David and Matt, but people can get really, really invested on whether the width of the wall at this point means A or B, and they take, particularly then, they were taking things very personally, rather than just seeing it as an academic, this is my view, then they very much found that if you were, critiquing their theory, and Charles was very much not on the F G Simpson side. And it's a real shame because, as with Grace's work with the Clayton collection, the work that she did and that her father did in the excavations that are published here gets overshadowed by all that personal baggage, I suppose. I am going to finish with this quote that Tatiana had already used, that she writes this is during the bad times in the late 60s, early 70s. And I'm sorry, but I think she is true. That is a truth. I started going to sort of Northern Roman frontier seminars and other things at Newcastle, and I was warned beforehand, watch out for the back row, with the really sort of tricky questions, or and I, luckily, I think it had always started to be phased out, but there was a lot, strong personalities on the wall and very personal views on the research questions. And I think if people, Charles Daniels, Eric Burley, Ian Richmond, I'm sure they could be equally as scathing and as equally as forthright, but it is, viewed differently, sadly, if you're a man or a woman. And I'm just going back to the title, which is the whole point of rather than just giving you some info, is that she did move away from her father's shadow, I think. F G Simpson worked on the wall. He was an excavator. He was really key in those things. She forged her own path. She went down the pottery studies route. But she comes back to the wall, looking at the Clayton collection, and I almost think she puts herself back in his shadow by the watermills and military works. And that's, that's her tribute to him, publishing it. But then she also has very much got his sense of what is right and what should be done, and she can't back down. And it's just a real shame that, for me, both her and F G Simpson's work, I think, gets mixed up with the personalities. And I feel like sometimes if you're a woman, the personality things are more impactful on your research than the male ones. But yeah, I'm not sure I would have liked to cross Grace, and I will finish there.